movement, so I was assuming there wasn't a lot of talking.
Mm-hmm.
But she just, spent most of the dinner on her phone.
Mm.
Which, it annoyed me, and I wasn't even with her.
Yeah. Oh.
So yeah, and tonight will be the last observation. So what I have noticed by kind of creating this grid is that, like, majority of the individuals using their cell phone are, on my estimate, like under the age of 40.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not sure if that's another cultural aspect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, there's definitely generational differences in how we use cell phones and how we expect to use cell phones. So I'm probably at the end of the generation of folks who did not have cell phones when we were growing up. And folks younger than me did in high school or even much earlier. And so they're technological natives, right? It's just part of their reality is that they should always have this thing with them. And I really like how you were describing the family of the kids who are using it as part of their conversation and part of their interactions. And it's just, to them, an obvious thing that they would have there and be part of their conversations and discussions because it's so highly integrated into their worldview and into their mind, their expectations for dinner and that sort of things. Whereas people who are older and who didn't have cell phones maybe until they were into their adulthood, that they had created a different worldview and different expectations for those sorts of interactions before this new thing was introduced into it. And so I'm curious too, now that you've mentioned it, we have this kind of cultural complaint, I guess. I don't think that any of us are unique or strange for kind of calling out and thinking, well, people are on their cell phones and that changes how we interact with each other. Like, I hear that a lot from people, but maybe now that you're observing it, you're seeing like new cultural norms are coming up where you can like look at your cell phone but not keep it out. And keeping it out has been so universally accepted as, very poor form in a social situation that maybe it's just not that common anymore. And we have like this outlier of this one girl who never looked up her whole conversation, but for the most part, other people have figured out ways to incorporate it into their lives. It's very interesting data. So yeah.
My theories, I definitely think it's grounded theory, but I just wasn't sure about case studies because of the observation and I thought some of it fit into that. But maybe not perfectly.
Yeah. The case study, you're going to the same restaurant every time?
Yeah.
And you're looking at these behaviors here in the space. So yeah, definitely could be a case study. I'm looking at cell phone usage here at this restaurant. But the grounded theory portion of it is trying to come up with this understanding of how do we use cell phones, but grounded within this particular case study. I could definitely see it being both.
Okay.
Yeah.
So far, I did was going to do the third one yesterday, but I had a supposed to be simple procedure turned out to be an unexpected complication. I was in the hospital longer than I expected. I didn't. So far, I keep looking at each research method. First, as a narrative, and then said no, it's not just one individual because there's intake officers and each shift have a primary and secondary. So depending on how busy they are, they both could be working. And we have 3 different shifts. And I'm thinking there's more than one intake officer and there's multiple middle coming together. Eliminated that part. Then is a grounded or case. But then I was thinking it could be anything. depending on how I put it. So I haven't really narrowed down which theory I'm gonna use it. So,
I
I need your help.
Yeah, I think this is kind of phenomenology because you're looking for a description, correct, of like what it means, how the intakes go, what that means for the people who are experiencing the intake, if it's their first time or a second, third, fourth time, right? If they're new to it or if they're not new to it. So it kind of seems like it's a phenomenon, like you're looking at this phenomenon of meaning or of experience walking into it. One of the difficulties with it being phenomenology, though, is that you have a professional role in that space. So you already have a different mindset and a different worldview of what is going on within that phenomenon because you have a different perspective that you have been experiencing for a while. And so the difficulty would be, can you fully set aside that professional perspective in order to understand it from the intake's perspective? And so in that case, maybe it's not phenomenology, maybe it is a case study of the behaviors that happen in this location. I think that would kind of depend on what you are most interested to get out of it.
And when I called yesterday at the end of the day and the new committals, they said now they're all, returning. So I said, if I didn't go in, it would have been another
Oh, golly.
waste of time. So I'm kind of worried that if they're ever gonna, when I go in next time, and if ever new committal gonna come in to see the behavior.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my concern right now.
Mm-hmm. If you never get a new committal, would it be enough to have the return intakes? Would that be sufficient for you just to kind of explore that experience without having the comparison?
So then I will lose the comparison, but I will just generally how they interact.
Mm-hmm.
I can skip over that one.
Yeah. Would that work for you?
I have to make it work.
Yes, true. Very true. So you may have no other choice, I guess. That's true. But yeah, I think it could still be a very interesting thing. In terms of whether it's a case study or a phenomenon or phenomenology, I think that would kind of depend on the extent to which you are intent on describing all aspects of the situation, all of the behaviors, all of the interactions and ascribed meanings. I think that if you're trying to get an overall entire look at what this situation is and how people move within that situation, then that would be a case study. If you're trying to figure out what is the meaning of the people coming in for the committals, their experience of that process, whether you have the comparison or whether it's just all return committals, then I would say that if it's very much focused on just their experience and what it's like for them, then that would be a phenomenology.
Okay.
I can go.
All right.
I haven't. My observation opportunities are pretty few and far between since I'm doing games with my daughter's soccer team. I haven't had any since the last one with my work and her schedule, but I have tomorrow, Friday, and Sunday coming right up. So I'm going to get 3 bang, bang, bang right back to back.
How's the weather looking?
It's looking, hopefully, if not, we're
Okay.
going to have to do another practice, which may be a good thing. I guess I'll just take it as it comes. It's been a good thing in the sense that I've gotten to look over Rachel's example of the observation, and it's helped me tremendously looking at like the very specific, more specific details than I had thought that I had gotten. even going back over my first set of notes after looking at that example, I was able to just recall things on my own that were like, oh yeah, like there's so much more in this little one observation than I originally had thought. So it's helped me in that aspect of it. As far as after reading chapter 4 of the text this past week, I couldn't help but, I don't know if anybody else, so I'm sure you did, but I couldn't help but put my project toward up against each one of the things, each one of the methods, and it really matches up. For me, at first it didn't, but
Ethnography.
Ethnography. At first it didn't. I was like, well, is a middle school girls soccer team an ethnic group? But then I figured, well, yeah, sure it is. You know.
Well, yes, it's not an ethnic group, but the ethnos would be people, right? So
it's,
yeah,
you know,
they're a group.
As far as their behaviors,
they would have a
and what
culture
about
and
the socialization and the learning and the domination and the inequality, and, you know, within that group. But then it really fit with case study too. As far as, you know, being a very specific group that I'm studying. And I guess maybe we'll discuss this later, but the intrinsic case study, was that something like a case within a case? Was I understanding that right? Or?
Yeah, the intrinsic would be where you have within just one piece within a case.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that would be the compare and contrast between the varying age groups of the girls on the soccer team. That would be the case within that case, I think.
Yeah.
Is as well as I understand it thus far. So you know, that's where I'm kind of at with this. After reading this week's reading, I'm a little more clear on what I'm looking for, combined with the example of Rachel's notes that I read that you put up. So both of those are going to help me tremendously in, you know, deciding on what I'm looking for.
Excellent.
That.
Yeah. Ethnographic case study, you can definitely combine both of those.
Okay.
And I think that it does sound like it's appropriate for what you're doing. Yeah.
Perfect.
Right? Emily?
For mine, like Jeremy said, I kind of compared it with all of them, and I feel like I can build a case around like all of them except really the narrative research, because for phenomenology, I'm looking to describe the experiences that people are having. For grounded theory, like studying the process and interactions involving the individuals. For the
Ethnography.
one,
Yeah.
it's culture. They all live in the same spot, and they all do the same activities and that type of thing. And then for the case study, it's multiple cases, but like focusing on one topic, so it's kind of like the collective case study with that. So I wasn't really sure which one like fit best, or if so maybe I have to look at some more stuff like that. But I'm going back tonight to do my third observation. And for my second observation, I decided that instead of sitting in one spot where everybody came down, I was going to shadow one of the workers that was answering the bells. So I picked one wing that has 12 rooms on it instead of focusing on everyone as a group. So kind of cut back so I can see like who the people are ringing the bells, how many times they're going, and like the interaction up close. And I think I've gotten a lot more from that than trying to single out like what's happening where. So I think when I go back, I'm gonna stay on the same wing, but I'll be with a different person because they rotate. So that way I'll get different interactions with different people and see how that correlates. And also, I want to look at what happens when the managers aren't there, opposed to when they do, because I noticed I went in through a dinner service, and at the end of dinner, the managers leave, and then after that, it takes them a little bit longer to start answering the bells. So I thought that was interesting, and I kind of want to focus on that when I go back tonight, because I'm going back later, and none of the managers will be there.
Yeah, I see your dilemma with which approach is it, or which approach is more likely. Because when you were first starting to talk through it, I was going to say, well, it's definitely not an ethnography, because you're not really looking into the culture of the setting, and you are looking to the number of bell rings and how that influences interaction, but you are looking into much more of the culture thing, especially looking at these power dynamics with the managers versus not the managers and all of that. So I can see ethnography going. You're looking at the phenomenon of the bell ringing, right? And what that means to the interactions. Maybe even developing a bit of theory behind that, so that would be grounded theory. And then of course you're looking at all of these different contextual issues, so maybe that's also a case study. I think you could make an argument for any of them. So maybe just pick one that sounds fun to you and kind of base your mindset there, because I agree with you. Like, I could see all of the approaches working. Yeah. Yeah, that is true. Yeah. Case studies are really popular. So. All right. Oh, golly, sorry. I want my lungs back. Any other questions, comments generally about how your research is going? Any other new thoughts that came up while we were talking about our different experiences? All right, let's take a break right now. We'll come back at 2 o'clock and talk about the readings. All right. So we're going to talk through the 5 approaches right now, and continuing on with our class discussion, but we're going to switch it a little bit so that as we're going through one by one, if you have any questions generally, yes, please ask them. If you have any comments, please make them. But if your research is using this approach, either in whole or in part, like some of you are doing multiple approaches, then you can bring forth your research as well as example for how this might possibly work, and we can talk through that a little bit. Does that sound good, reasonable? All right, let's start with narrative, begin at the beginning, and I think nobody is doing narrative research. Is that true? That is true. Nobody. You guys suck. Narrative research is the best. Oh, I love it. Of course, I'm a writer, so narrative research brings together my two loves, geekiness in writing and geekiness in research. So it has allowed me to do like both of these things, put them both together in a way that makes me quite happy. So there are a couple of different ways that narrative research is used and can be used. So one, you use narrative basically is the method. So you are exploring stories. You are either that people tell you, or if there are artifacts that you can find, like text or documents, even photographs or videos or things like that. You basically like pull the stories out of this, and so you're using the stories as the data collection method. And then the other is using narrative as kind of the analysis to explore the phenomenon. So narrative research can be used a lot with like phenomenology, where you're trying to really get to the essence of what is this thing, what is this meaning behind what we are exploring. But also narrative is used to relate ethnography or used to relate case studies, particularly when it's something that is very uncommon to a larger audience. So for example, when I was doing my research in Tuvalu, I didn't do a full narrative study, but there were pieces of it where I was trying to tell the story of what is this like here in Tuvalu, because let's be frank and honest, probably most of you had never heard of Tuvalu before I started talking to you about it, right? So any way that I can use this kind of storytelling technique to bring you there when you may never otherwise have an interaction with that location, much less with the meanings, the phenomena of climate change and what does that mean in Tuvalu. Like narrative can in that way be a good process for analysis and reporting. And it's used in any or all of these different ways. So when you say I'm doing a narrative study, it could be methods, it could be the data I'm collecting, it could be the reporting style, it could be the analysis style. Like, there's a lot of different ways that it gets used. Does that make sense?
So it's more of a method itself rather than encompassing a bunch of methods like the other ones do.
Yeah. Or at least it can be. I mean, like, you can do, let's just say yes. Yeah, let's just say yes.
So I would liken it to like archaeology, or like someone who's a biographer. They would use like probably strictly narrative research, like compiling all types of stories or first-hand accounts from people that knew this person or something, and kind of putting it all together to tell their story from beginning to end.
When you said archaeology, do you mean like historian?
Well, I meant like someone who goes to study ancient Mayan culture, where they dig, actual archaeologists, where they use things that they found, texts or artifacts or pottery from the ground or something that makes up a story, that tells a story that they kind of piece together, and then the narrative is
Yes,
your report.
I can see that. Yeah. So that actually, I think that's a very culturally rich tool that they could use. Archaeologists would often use other things, but like the biographers and the people who do like collect life histories from people. And in fact, I think there's a life history example in the appendices of this book, if you want to read through that. Historians use narrative research when they're trying to get that primary source material. So they'll go and talk to people who experienced some historical event, who were there, and then they say, tell me about it. And so they can use narrative research for that primary text. Journalists use narrative research a lot when they're diving into some very deep issue or phenomena. Yes, Leanne?
Page 55, the very first paragraph in the middle is that how individuals are enabled and constrained by the social resource situated in the interactive performances, and how narrators develop interpretation. Of there, what does that mean by enabled and constrained by social resources?
A good example that we have of that is if we're going to try to tell like the story of the American dream, right? We're all familiar with this concept, this phenomena, I guess. So we have this idea that anyone who works hard can become president of the United States. This is wrong. We've had, like 49 presidents, something like that. So that means 49 people can become president of the United States. The rest of us don't get to do that. But also, we have different access to resources within our society. We have different opportunities. We have different hurdles that we have to jump over, different expectations that are placed on us. And so the narrative can tell the story of those opportunities and those constraints. We might... let me think. From my own personal history, my dad, who he was a veteran, and so he had access to the GI Bill. And so we can tell the story, right, of how the GI Bill is meant to work and what resources it's supposed to provide. But then the reality is, when he was using the GI Bill, there was all this stuff going on with Reaganomics, and because of his like different economic background, he still had all these additional hurdles that he had to jump through. So telling the story of his life would get to those details that might otherwise be missed if we were just looking at the broad approach of what does the GI Bill do. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Yeah, it's basically just kind of getting at, we can use the storytelling to explain the differences. Whereas with quantitative research, we might say like 89% of people can blah, blah, blah. With the narrative research, we can focus in on a case example of what does that mean for these 89%, or what does it mean for the 11% on the other side, and give the specifics of their ability to interact. So there's a couple of different things that are mentioned within the procedures for conducting narrative research that are generally of interest to qualitative researchers, because many qualitative researchers will use different data collection methods regardless of which approach they're using, but also that are important for qualitative researchers to keep in mind as we're moving forward. So on page 55 under number 2, they talk about the field texts. And so, for example, we can go out and gather life stories, but we can also use pieces of information or documents or other things that we create or that already exist. So, for example, Ryan might tie in the AMA Code of Ethics into his study, and so he has this field text that he would be able to compare and connect in with. Jen kind of created an outline of the restaurant and a map of where people are sitting so that she can like mark down how all of this. Lexi might do the same with the location of her store that she is observing, because maybe the color scheme and the layout of the aisles and that sort of thing. And so we're putting together both the individual personal experiences that we might be observing, or we might be interviewing and asking questions about, or taking surveys about, or whichever other methods we're using, but we might connect it with these other artifacts of data that are important to the story, and then figure out how we can loop those things together in order to appropriately tell the story with the data that we have. Does that make sense?
So is the field text existing literature, or is it what we're writing down that we can refer to?
Yes.
Both?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Also, our field notes, if you take very detailed notes, you can always refer back to those as pieces of evidence, right? Because you were there and you wrote it down when it happened. Yeah. Oh yeah, and so like some of the other styles that we might have with other methods we will not be trying out in this class, but you may use otherwise. Having people record a diary or a journal. So if you have like a group of people that you're studying and you ask them about this thing, maybe they go throughout the day and jot down throughout their day how things are going or something like that. So you can use different texts like that that are created by participants within research as well. We won't do that in this class, but it's fun. It's really fun to like pull together lots of things like this where you get little glimpses into people's minds throughout their lives. Qualitative research is so much fun. And then on number 4 on the next page, they talk about restorying. And this is important in a couple of ways. One is that particularly when we are interviewing or observing or surveying or getting journals or whatever of multiple participants, we try to pull out the common themes or the important themes, even if they're not common, so that we can create a larger narrative of understanding that we then relate to the audience. And so restorying is a powerful tool because we're able to weave together themes that are necessary for understanding our research and the data that we've collected. But restorying is also very important for us to be cautious with and careful of, and particularly rigorous with, because we're the ones telling that story rather than the people who belong to that story. And so, for example, with my research in Tuvalu, I wrote my dissertation. And I wrote it from stories that people told me in interviews, and I wrote it from participant observation. So I was there in community events, and I wrote down things that were happening, and I checked in with people, does this make sense, and all of that. But ultimately, those are my words in my dissertation. That's my perspective and my point of view. And so ultimately, that comes from an educated American woman who is living in Hawaii, who is from Tennessee, with my background and my knowledge and my worldview and my perspectives. So ultimately, it's going to be lacking parts of their voice because it's coming through my voice. And so we need to be aware of that. I'm blanking on the word, guys. What is it? Reflexivity. I almost said reciprocity. We need to be aware of that reflexivity, of making sure we know when is this our bias, when is this our perspective, when is it actually the perspective of our participants, and how can I make sure that that's true? Like, that's a very rigorous process to be able to make sure that we are authentically portraying the experiences and the narrative that is coming from there rather than the narrative that's coming through me.
I have a question.
Yes.
Towards like the bottom, it says the plot or storyline may also include a three-dimensional narrative, includes space, the personal and social, the past, present, and future, in the place, which in parentheses it says situation. Does that mean like the situation that like you were in Tuvalu, like you would have to?
Yeah, so I was at a community setting, right? We were having a big, it was like a celebration for all of the students from this one island, and we're in the Falelau, so this kind of cultural space, and they were doing all of these traditions that had been passed down for generations and generations. And so there I have a description of the space, a description of social norms and how people are interacting with each other, how they're dressing, what foods we're eating, who speaks when, who dances when, who sings when, what's the, who's being honored, who is doing the honoring, all of these things. Where does this come from? So I have the past, like what does this mean? Why are they doing this to celebrate students? Because it's celebrating the future, and like, so I can weave together all of these things, even though right then I was only in that one moment, in that one setting, but I can tell the story of all of that. Any other thoughts, questions with narrative? All right, let's move on to Betsy's favorite, phenomenological research.
Before we start, I love this little, the intentionality of consciousness. I don't know, I love the way it's worded and what it says. This idea that consciousness is always directed toward an object, reality of an object then is inextricably related to one's consciousness of it, thus reality, according to Husserl, is not divided into subjects and objects, but into the dual Cartesian nature of both subjects and objects as they appear in consciousness. That's like if the tree falls in the woods and nobody's around to hear it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Simplify. I like the way it's worded.
Yeah. I remember when I first started doing qualitative research, the first time I read this book, the first time I started looking at all of these different types of approaches, I got very kind of lost in the philosophical perspectives of phenomenology. And in fact, I kind of in my mind closed the book on phenomenological research because of that. I thought this is just too far away from where I want to move at this point. And I think that I still, I do have some philosophical background at this point, but I think not enough that I would ever be interested in devoting over 100 pages to the philosophical assumptions of my research before I then move on to the methods. Like that is never going to happen for me. I just can't imagine that happening. At the same time, though, I have since looked more into the philosophy in terms of like the assumptions, the worldview, the perspectives, the cultural the cultural context in which I view things. within my climate change research. And so looking at why do we value certain types of climate, why do we value certain types of action within climate change and things like that. And I think that understanding this broader worldview, broader perspective, and broader cultural context that is bringing us back to this phenomenon can help us to step away from it and kind of try to erase our own preconceived notions when we start to try to explore a phenomenon. Does that make sense? Too philosophical? So yeah, phenomenology is when we're trying to understand a phenomenon, right? And he gives a couple of examples, and I like actually the first example I think that he mentions is like grief is universally experienced, right? So everybody can understand that this is a phenomenon that is universally shared. And in order to try to get to the quality of that experience, the essence of that phenomenon, we might look at lots of different stories of grief, lots of different artifacts, books or movies or narratives of these things, different stories that we have, different interviews or surveys or whatever methodology we're using, which is basically trying to get to our participants' understanding of what does this mean in their lives and what are the things that influence it within their lives. Going into the philosophy, like if we were going to be looking at the philosophical perspectives of the phenomena, if we're looking at grief, well, we can think, okay, ultimately this isn't just about, it definitely is about the loss of that individual person or animal, if it's a pet, or if you're losing a place or something like that, whatever the grief is for. It's about that loss, but it's also about the loss of the role of that person or animal within that person's life. An example being my dad died, and it was less than a week before somebody asked my mom when she was going to start dating again, which is awful. But common. And when I tell people that, they're like, oh yeah, so-and-so had that happen too. It's a whole thing. But it's because people are recognizing she didn't just lose this person that she's known for so long and loves, but she's lost like the role of having this partner in her life, right? And all of the things that go along with that. Same thing like when a pet dies. The first question, oh, are you getting another dog? Still grieving, come on, that sort of thing. So we recognize it's not just the loss of that animal, it's the loss of having a pet in your home, come and jump on you when you walk home, and like all of these things. And so that's two different philosophical understandings. Also, it ties into our cultural understanding of death and dying, how we share grief, how we understand grief, how we understand loss. Is there a religious implication? Is there a cultural implication? Is there what's the right word? Is there a secular implication? If someone's atheist or agnostic, yeah, they're gone forever. Adam's going back into the universe. Like, what does it mean beyond that? There's so many different philosophies that kind of go into it. And then I, as a researcher, would have to start thinking, okay, where do I stand with that? What is my understanding? Because as much as possible, I need to bring that to a baseline of 0 so that I can then just absorb the participants' stories and try to figure out what their experience of that phenomenon is without my overlay of perspectives and worldview and biases and everything else.
This perspective would play, it always does play a big part, but would that be like particular to this case where perspective would play? Again, the only thing I kept thinking of is like the whole thing that what's normal for the spider is chaos for the fly is the same thing. That it's, but for one, depending on which perspective you're looking at it from, it's a completely different thing. Like the loss of a pet. So it's sad in the sense that you lose your pet and you're grieving, but it may be a relief in the sense that your pet is no longer suffering from being sick.
Right.
I guess.
Yeah.
I was just.
I don't have an answer.
I don't
Yes.
know that I was looking for one. I guess it was more of an observation than a question.
Yeah, I think phenomenological research is it's a very fun but intensive set of critical, like it requires an awful lot of critical thought. It's an awful lot of brain work in trying to really understand what does this thing mean.
I feel like if you're drawn to a topic enough to want to do that in-depth research and then step back and take your step out, it just blows my mind. I feel like.
Mm-hmm.
To be so interested in something that you want to spend that much time on it and then not have your perspective or as little of your own perspective in it at the same time is just it's weird.
Yeah.
On page 61, he says, just like she said about break it out as much possible, that's almost experience.
Mm-hmm.
And earlier you mentioned, why, if I'm going to go into a phenomenology about my research, then I will reserve my opinion, my experience. Just being there as an observing eyes, write everything down. I really last observation note, I thought something was the more people in my thoughts. So that means I should reserve those parts from now on if I were to go for the phenomenology.
I would actually the opposite. I would try to also record your thoughts and your perspectives, your opinions and judgments, like try to put those down on paper so that you can recognize them in the observations. So for example, if you write down this person starts screaming blah 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 these specific words and you have that down, I would put, what do you think about it? Why do you think that person is doing that? You know, what is your perspective? How is everybody responding? Like that sort of thing. But then also try to sense through and think through, what does it mean from their perspective? Why is it that they are trying to start yelling? What is the goal behind it? What is the meaning behind it? What is the purpose behind it? And try to understand their perspective as well. But I think the first step in removing our own perspective is to recognize our perspective.
Okay.
Back on page 58, like right at the top, it says the basic purpose of phenomenology is to reduce individual experiences with a phenomenon to a description of the universal essence.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what that means.
So,
I think it's in the parentheses, sums it up to grasp the very nature of things.
Mhm.
Questions being asked.
Yeah. I was going to try to tie it in with your research, but I don't know that it works exactly very well. But like with Betsy's, she's watching all of these kids, right? Lots of different kids and the ways that they behave. And if this was a full-scale study, maybe there would be interviews there where she would ask the kids, why did you do this, or why are you doing that? Maybe there would be interviews even with the adults that work with them to see like their perspectives and their observations. Maybe there would be different like setups of scenarios to allow for different kids to play at different times and see what happens. Like, so there might be lots and lots of different potential data gathering, but ultimately it's not going to be about any one kid or any one kid's decision process, or even like what it's like when you go out as, you know, a 4-year-old and play, but trying to get to the universal experiences of being 4 on a playground and going out to play. Like, what does that feel like? Where is your brain at when you are 4 and you have this whole space to go out?
Kind of like what's most common.
Yeah, what does it mean for everyone in that situation. Yeah. Let's see. Actually, we'll hold off on the data analysis portion. I do want to just kind of call out on page 61 when they're talking about some of the procedures for conducting phenomenological research. They get down to the data analysis and kind of developing clusters and gathering significant statements, or in an observational study, significant actions or something like that. That might be something that you want to look for, and so just kind of keep it in the back of your mind for a week and a half from now or so, when you're going back and actually doing your own data analysis. This might be one of the steps that you would want to go through, is to pull out significant events in order to kind of set those aside and see if you can tell the story using those. Other questions or thoughts with phenomenology? All right, so grounded theory, and we have a few of you who might be using grounded theory. It's basically like describing a phenomena or a case example or something like that, but then trying to at least develop further research questions. Oh, it did it again. Oh, it's still recording this time. Okay, sorry. I lost part of the video in our earlier discussion. It's glitching. It's all fine. So yeah, grounded theory would be like trying to understand the phenomenon that you're looking at, but also trying to generate some sort of explanation for why it is there, why it exists. Within phenomenology, you're just trying to explain or describe, this is what this thing is. Which on its own can be very powerful, especially when you get to something that is, I'm being too floral, I guess, like a precious part of the human experience, right? So something very deep. What is it like to be a 4-year-old on a playground? Let's describe it from the mind of a 4-year-old as best we can from research. Like, that is so essential to, life, at least at that point of life, or same with grief or poverty or different things that we might be looking at the phenomenon. But grounded theory is then trying to say, okay, why is it like this? And you may not, within especially a small kind of mini study like we're doing, you may not be able to generate any whys, but you may be able to generate theories like, maybe this is it, maybe this is why. Of course, we'd need to do more research in order to know if this is why, but you can at least start kind of putting that out there, even within our own studies. A full-scale grounded theory is going to generate these questions, go back and gather more data, test those questions, generate new questions or generate refined questions, get some more data, go back over and over again. It can be a very long and intensive process. Also very fun and satisfying, because you're developing your own new theories that will probably have your name on it forever, and that's cool. But yeah, that's the general overview. And of course, the Strauss and Corbin book is based within grounded theory. So even though it discusses lots of different types of methods for data collection and analysis that we'll be using throughout the semester, ultimately the approach that they're taking is grounded theory. What questions and thoughts do we have within this section?
Actually, this is one of the ones that I did consider, just because the whole idea, I didn't know what I was looking for until I saw it. I don't know if that kind of fits with grounded theory a bit, but I had highlighted the investigator seeks to systematically develop a theory that explains process, action, or interaction on a topic. So I mean, that kind of really fit with mine too. It's like I was looking for certain behaviors and actions within my observations to even tell me what I was looking for. And I started with the general idea, and after the first observation, it kind of took a completely different turn of what I was looking for. So
Yes. Yes. And as we've discussed before, grounded theory is very much based within the data that we collect. So even if you did have kind of a mindset or a perspective or an expectation walking into it, ultimately it has to follow what you see, and that is what's happened in your case too. So yes, grounded theory can start with as general a question is, what happens when? Or at this place, what happens? Or something like that, and then kind of develop your understanding from there. So I do want to call out the, starting down at the bottom of page 64 and then moving on over to 65, there's a description of the coding strategies. This is a generally good coding strategy. I would say that in addition to in phenomenology, where we're kind of like pulling out these significant statements or significant actions to create clusters of meaning, my go-to data analysis process when I have observational data, interview data, survey data, or anything like that where there's typed out statements or description or something like that, is to go to first an open coding process. And what I'm doing there is just reviewing all of the data that I have with this open-minded sense of what is important. And I try to draw out first, what are the major themes? And that might even be my first pass. I just see, okay, I think I'm kind of seeing a pattern here. Maybe this is important, maybe this is important, maybe this is important. And I start trying to piece my data together with these different themes. And so with the open codes, maybe with like Raylene, with your cell phone usage, one of the things that you mentioned, like maybe the existence of cell phone in the conversation, maybe the existence of other adults present might have an influence. Maybe if they are in this part of the playground versus another part, maybe if the kid is this age versus this age. So you kind of like get these few kind of large things together and you start parsing out the data into those different big themes. These are all the times where I saw people, multiple adults with kids. These are all the times where I saw a cell phone came out in usage. These are all the times when they were young kids versus older kids, stuff like that. So you'd start parsing out the data there, and there's your open coding. You're just looking for these kind of large scale themes. Then you're going to go back for an axial coding process. And with the axial coding, you can kind of think of it like spokes on a wheel, right? And so this is all the times where we had other adults present. It was a couple. Here you can see this. It was friends who were along for the ride. It was multiple families with multiple kids and multiple adults that came together and start trying to like find out what are the different things within this one theme. It assisted with engagement with the kids. It detracted from engagement with the kids. And so you start pulling out all of the different ways that you can look at each of those larger themes. And so you kind of develop a much richer process of understanding each of those large themes because there are so many different working pieces. And then once you have all of these wheels, right, you have these lots of different descriptive pieces, themes and codes, as we would call it, parsed out and together, you have so much different information, right? You have, okay, I figured out like 100 different things that seem to be true about all of this. Then you start trying to tell a story with all of that. And that's going to be kind of the selective coding process, where you're trying to make sense of all of these things happening together. What are the pluses and the minuses? What are the positive influences or the negative influences? What are the things that seem to have strong influence versus weak influence? Just whatever type of story it is, the question that you're trying to answer, that's what you're getting at then with the selective coding process. And along with this, you might pull out significant statements or significant actions to highlight as an example of this theme or of this story or of this narrative that you are telling. So put a little mark here in your book because this is one of the ways that I just always go to with when I come home with all of my data and I think, crap, what now? This is the what now. That's what I do next. And within our observational studies, you may start coding before you get all of them, but I think generally it becomes very useful to have all of your data collected, all of your transcriptions down before you start doing a full analysis, because otherwise you're going to get halfway through and think, oh, I have to go back and start over again because I just realized this new thing that I didn't see earlier. So it can help to have all of it together first. The chapters that we're going to be reading in Corbin and Strauss for next week also are going to go over this in some more detail, so we'll have a little bit more. And was it Jen? Did you have a question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry. So I think during my observations, I've been so focused on the timestamp and then what's happening at each of the tables at that given time. In this case, would I want to restructure how I've written my notes so that I describe a table from beginning to end in order to catch those themes? Because right now I kind of feel like it's disjointed and all over the place.
Yes. I can see how that would work well, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you can switch your coding, or sorry, your data collection methods and strategies as you go through. And in fact, that's kind of why this is a useful exercise to start with the practicing. And particularly when we're starting, we're simultaneously learning how to do this while we're doing it. So yes, it's going to happen. But no, I would say don't think that that means you have to throw out what you've already taken because you're starting a new strategy. I think you can use both once you get to the data analysis section.
Okay, and then if I do change that and going back to observation 1, do I upload these new notes?
I'd love to see them.
Okay.
Yeah. Other thoughts, questions, comments with our grounded theory?
I really like the idea of coming up with your own theories based on things you're looking at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is a conditional matrix essential?
No.
Okay.
And in fact, I'm pretty sure I'm not teaching that in this class.
Okay.
Yeah. It's in the book, but I think we're skipping that chapter if I remember correctly. Yeah.
And a little bit complicated subject.
Yeah. I don't think that I'm asking you to develop enough or gather enough data to do that effectively. So, yeah. I know that I don't want to set you up for failure, so I'm pretty sure that I chose to skip that. Yeah. Yeah. Also, when you are doing a full-scale study, within the procedures also, I think it's talking about the conditional matrix, but then also, other things. you will want to continue gathering data in a grounded theory until you have saturated. And that means everything, when you're pulling in new data, it's just repetitive from other data you've already gotten. You are not finding anything new. There is nothing that is broadening at this point. You want to get to that point of saturation where you feel pretty confident that you've seen all there is to see on this topic. Again, in these many studies that we're doing in this class, you will not reach saturation. You don't have time for it in this class, so. But it's an important concept in research, so know about it. Okay. So, any other questions, comments with grounded theory? All right, we're going to move on to ethnography. Ethnography is when we are starting to look at culture and people and trying to understand group norms and relationships. And as we've mentioned already, this can be an ethnic culture. It can be people who live within a certain region or a certain country, but it can also be a culture of norms within a professional setting or even a temporary group setting where people kind of come together and interact with each other for a brief time and then never again. They'll still develop norms within that setting, right? What just came to mind was like a flash mob. Yeah, you heard these, like the improv everywhere. They're like, hundreds of people meet up and wear this color shirt, and then we're all going to start screaming at this time, and then we're going to run away laughing, or something like that. Like, everybody has this set idea of what they're going to do, what they expect of each other, what's important. They have this shared identity. Do you want to wave?
He's like, well, I'm on TV.
And so, yeah, within an ethnography, we are looking at these norms, these expectations, these shared identities, these shared meanings that we have. And a lot of it has to do with activities that we have conducted together. And the more, I'm going into activity settings theory now, which, no, is not in your book. But the idea behind activity settings theory, and I am very steeped in this actually because my mentor in grad school was the person who developed activity settings theory, which is used very widely in my field. But we have these different places where we come together and we do things together. And the more times we share settings and do things together and have these shared experiences and this common history with each other, the more we develop a sense of identity and unity and shared understanding for life. And so we start developing what we call in psychology intersubjectivity, which is just basically a fancy word for meaning we're starting to develop culture. And so every time something new happens, every time there's an experience, we understand it more and more from a shared perspective, the more we share activities and settings with each other. And so when we're thinking very broadly of a culture, like from an ethnicity or from a region, we might be thinking of like hundreds or even thousands of years of shared settings that have been passed from one generation to the next, and shared interpretations that have been passed from one generation to the next. And so that's kind of where culture develops over a long term. But even within a short term, you're coming to school here. You share classes with each other, you see each other, you kind of learn the culture of each specific class and that you take. So my classroom probably feels different. It has a different quality to it than other classrooms because there are different norms and different expectations. There might all have kind of a shared connection with each other. For example, there's a professor and there are students, certain structures like that. But then even just our individual nuances can change. Thinking about ethnography from, for example, Ryan's perspective, looking at this professional setting, they have a shared professional ethics background. They have been trained, maybe even in different places, but in similar skills and structures and purposes and expectations for professionalism and for action and activity. But then they're all working together here now in this location and have been working together here in this location for a long enough time that they have very specific expectations for what each person should do and how they should interact with each other. And so an ethnography would be trying to gather information about all of these things in order to say, who is this group? What does it mean for them to be part of this group? And how do they behave and interact with each other? Now I'm going to be quiet for a bit to see if you have any questions or thoughts on ethnography.
If I was going to use this one for my observation research, would I split it up into two different, like the culture of like the employees and then the culture of those residents living there?
You could do that, yes. You could also look at it as the culture of the setting, which would include different power structures, right? Or different roles within the settings. Either of those would be a fine approach.
In this case, would you want to reference, like, you know, because of the different roles, like pulling out job descriptions and looking at those, or like expectations of each one of those groups? Like in your case, is there a different expectation between nurses and doctors? Because there's definitely a different job description.
Yeah. Well, it depends. I mean, so like we were talking about like cohesivity amongst groups in the hospital. So I actually, I'll answer your question in a second. When I get to work, if I have the ED, I actually look to see who's on, which positions are on, which ones are coming on, because I've learned that particular, like, and not so much just the doctors, what nurses are on, what lab techs are on, what imaging techs are on, and stuff like that, because I know how specific people like specific things, like what nurses like stuff down what way, what physicians want this amount of dosage back to back, or just particular things, like over in a code scenario, I know what doctors like Mac, laryngoscope blades over Miller, what size they particularly like, what size tubes they normally use, do they want to do direct visualization or do they want to use the glide scope to do it, like it all, you learn all these things when you, like you were saying, in different scenarios and repeated over time. People just learn and come, you know, when they come to learn, because they learn each other and kind of just mingle well, right? So I can kind of get my head in that mindset. As far as people having certain expectations, it's just knowing, I don't really think so. I think it's just part of the group. You know, everybody just knows what to do. I mean, if you're a new person, you know, the expectation is it's kind of, if you don't know what you're doing, kind of make that known. Don't be some pompous, you know, a-hole. There's not the other word to describe it. Because there's been scenarios where we had a physician, a new one, who was only maybe a week into it was a seasoned doctor, but in this particular setting was only there for like a week. Then we had this code scenario, or it was an impending code scenario, but the patient needed to be intubated, and this person's like, had a God complex, right? And it kept screwing up the intubation, kept missing and kept going into the stomach, and the patient's SATs, oxygen saturations, were dropping down to like low 60s, high 50s, which is really bad. If you didn't, like anything less than like 80, you're getting really iffy with oxygen sats. So they're dipping down low 60s, high 50s, which the patient would, you could literally see them turning blue from the lack of oxygen in their body. And the physician's like, no, I got it. Because I was bagging, but it wasn't getting any change. And the nurse was just like, nope, you're done. And pushed the dog to the side and pulled the tube out of the patient's mouth.
Mm-hmm.
And then he's like, bag, you know? So that person, obviously, there was no cohesivity amongst the group. And actual other physicians were being called into the room while this scenario was happening.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it's just open mind and being, willing to be a part of a team. Clearly that physician wasn't.
Right.
So.
Right. And I think that that's also a good point too. Like you can start to understand the culture and the dynamics of a setting and a situation and a group of people when you walk into something new and you don't know what it is. And so you have to kind of like lay back a little while to figure out how things are done before you can kind of start doing things that way. And sometimes it's very minor. We're not even so much aware. We just kind of have this general sense of, I'm new, and even though I'm a competent person, I don't know how we do things here versus how I've done them in other places. And so we feel a little bit off-footed, I guess. And so that's kind of an indication that we have entered a new kind of subcultural setting. And so that's the perspective we can take when we're doing an ethnography, is trying to think about, okay, how would I understand what are the norms, how people are supposed to behave, how they show each other respect and professionalism, how they have teamwork, or in places where there's not teamwork, how do you not have teamwork if it's ultra competitive, like all of these different things, trying to find the quality of those situations so that people get along with each other according to those specific setting norms.
There's definitely generalized, in my scenario, there's definitely generalized power dynamic. But bringing in the AMA Code of Ethics, realistically, I mean, I have an associate's degree in respiratory therapy and I have 12 doctors off.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, they want to do something to a patient that's not indicated that could cause more problems for the patient. I mean, everybody in the medical field, regardless of your education, is an advocate for a patient advocate. So, I mean, if the patient's not going to benefit from it,
Mm-hmm.
then there's no sense of doing it.
Yeah.
Or if it's going to make the patient worse, like risk over outcome, right? I mean, I'm not going to sometimes you have to do particular procedures for the outcome of a patient, because if you don't, they're going to end up getting really sick or end up dying. So, risk versus benefit, right? So
Mm-hmm.
if they're going to die anyways, if you don't do anything, then do it. But there's been procedures where doctors have done elective stuff that they thought that the patient would benefit from, and then something went wrong during the surgery, and then the patient ends up with a perforated lung on a ventilator with a chest tube.
Mm-hmm.
All because they thought it needed to be done, but it really didn't.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And so I think that's interesting too, and not just in hospitals, but in a lot of settings, there are these cases where you have someone who is like in charge or an expert of some field, but then other people, even if they have less status and less power within that setting, if they have less expertise or different expertise, they still have to be able to contribute, because no one person can know all things or see all things or understand all things in every single setting at all times. And that called to memory kind of an old family story joke sort of thing. My dad worked in an emergency room. He was a pharmacist, and he was an a-hole. Love my dad dearly, but God, he was a loud, obnoxious person, and had a very brusque personality as well. And so when he got into it, he got into it with people. And a doctor had sent an order for the wrong medication that actually would have made the patient worse, and he refused to fill it. And then the doctor was giving him grief and yelling back and forth, and there was all this mess. And then Dad just prescribed what the patient needed, and then went back to his office, and then the doctor called and was screaming over the phone, and how dare you, blah, 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 and having that kind of God complex you were talking about, right? And it was their patient, so they were rightly, according to the official hierarchy of status, like they were in the right. But my dad's just still laying into them and telling them off and saying this is wrong. And then the doctor finally yells, I'm going to, report you to your supervisor. What is your name? And so my dad yells out, Arthur Hermsdorfer. And she's like, can you spell that? And he said, of course I can, and hangs up the phone. But even within these settings, and I think I'm thinking of a book called Outliers. Malcolm Gladwell, I think, is the name of the author. But he was talking about like in settings where, like in a plane, when you are flying an airliner, you have your primary pilot, you have your co-pilot, you have all of the other staff that are on there, and ultimately the decision comes down to the pilot. But these can be high-stress situations when everything is going wrong, just like a doctor's office, just like kind of any human setting. Lots of things are happening, and even the person who is in charge may not be able to see or understand all things. And so if you have a culture where that can't be questioned, or that person who is currently making a wrong decision, even if they are a competent person otherwise, can't be criticized or can't be stopped from making that wrong decision, then that can be dangerous, right? And so that's one of the things that we can look at in culture is like when we do have these power hierarchies, ultimately, who does it come down to? And can other people step up and make questions or criticisms or yell at you and tell you off, all of these things like that goes into the culture of the setting as well. And it's interesting stuff too to look at within ethnographies.
One thing I wanted to just, I guess, ask about or mention was the whole going native idea.
Mm-hmm.
Now, and I know I've heard you speak many times about your experience with Tuvalu and that community. Where it's like you almost become such a part of that culture that is it that you lose your ability to look at it objectively or to be able to gather fair research that would be beneficial or unbiased, or I just kept thinking of the movie Donnie Brasco when he was trying to gather research on the mafia, and he ultimately becomes them in the end, I guess is how it goes. But.
Yeah. Okay, so Donnie Brasco, I saw that movie some years back, but he's a cop, right? And he's deep undercover with the mafia, but ultimately he comes to understand and develop such close relationships, personal, kind, loving relationships with his mentor and his friends that are there. And he's also been in this setting with these norms for so long that he really loses sense of his real personality, his real self, and his real life that is back home with a wife and kids and all of this, but also his professional self and his professional ethics, which are, to be a police officer. And instead he's out committing crimes and he's covering up information because he's so deeply involved with this. Some researchers in psychology, sociology, public health, etc. may potentially find themselves in situations like this. Usually it's not going to be quite so much that. But I think that you kind of like hit the nail on the head. The question is, if I develop such a close interpersonal tie with the setting, will I be gathering legitimate, unbiased, valid information? Or is my information, my data that I'm collecting, going to be telling the story that I want to be telling? This is kind of written from the perspective that going native is a bad thing. And I hate that phrase, by the way. It's kind of racist, But But it's not necessarily a bad thing. That's where the reflexivity comes in, right? Is saying, these are the things that I value. This is the good that I want my research to do. This is why I'm looking at these things, so that other people can kind of see where your biases are. But ultimately, I think that we just want to be able to be aware of where our data is coming from. Are we still gathering what we set out to look for, or has our own professional judgment been kind of clouded by personal ties? Yeah. Right. When doing an ethnography, but also lots of other types of research where you are dealing with community members and participants, if you're trying to do a case study and understand a setting, if you are going into a community agency or a location where you want to learn more about the structure and function of this organization, you will oftentimes want key informants or a gatekeeper or something like that, like people, usually multiple people, but sometimes just one, who can explain to you what is happening. Key informants can also be very valuable to you when you are new to a setting that is not yours, so that when you see something or experience something, you can think, I think I understand what's going on here. Let me see if I can try to explain. Let me see if I can explain it to you, key informant. Does this make sense? Is this check out within your experience of reality, or does this make no sense and I'm seeing it from my outsider perspective? And so having those people that you can check in with, who can explain what's going on to you, can really, really help with an ethnography. When I was in Tuvalu, pretty much everyone speaks English to at least some degree. Some people are 100% perfectly fluent, some have like kind of a broken English, but nearly everyone speaks some amount of English. But most of day-to-day activities happen in Tuvaluan. And so if I'm doing participant ethnography, like that event, the ceremony that I went to, all of it happened in Tuvaluan. There was nothing in English that happened there. But I was sitting next to my sister Suena, who was able to explain, now they're singing a song about this, now he's giving a speech about this, and explain what's happening. And then later on, if I had questions, I could say, oh yeah, remember when they were going around with the perfume? What was that all about? Can you explain this to me? And so people can tell you from their perspective the what and the why and the history behind it and all of that, things that you might otherwise entirely miss because your perspective is just different. Even just as a researcher from another community could be entirely different than someone who knows that group, knows that organization, knows that culture. Top of page 72, also they talk about field issues of respect, reciprocity, deciding who owns the data, and other things like this are central to ethnography, but it's also central to a lot of community research. Particularly when you are working with vulnerable populations, there are a lot of cases in which researchers come in and take all of this information, they gather lots of data, and take it away. And then it gets published in places, and it costs money to get to, and it never makes it back to the community where it is useful. My friend Melody, who is in Spokane Tribe, she said that they have had a lot of issues with this within her tribe, and I know a lot of other indigenous communities have had issues like this as well. In her particular tribe, they had a linguist come in about 2 decades ago, I believe, who wanted to kind of capture the language before it was lost, because they have a generational gap. They have their elders who know how to speak the language, and then there were decades and decades where it was really kind of punished in schools and kids were not allowed to speak it, and the language was suppressed actively. And then now they're starting to do a revitalization, and so little kids can speak it, but then you have adults from a couple of generations who just can't, 20 and 30 and 40 and 50-year-olds who don't know how to use their their native language. And so they had this linguist come in, I want to capture this language, and developed like language books and developed dictionaries and gathered stories and recorded stories spoken in this language. And then he took it away and tried to charge them to get all these access to recordings and books and things that they had just given him for free. And so that is not practicing reciprocity. That is not showing respect for your participants, and that is not making useful research, at least not to them. Maybe it was great for his career, but it did not help Spokane Tribe at all. And so things like that can develop an awful lot of ill will, and particularly vulnerable populations, people who have lived in poverty, people who are ethnic and social minorities, have had lots of experiences of universities coming in and just crapping all over them. And other researchers and public health, even doctors, like we have the Tuskegee experiments and like all sorts of different things in our horrible past of researchers not being ethical in this way and not actually being helpful to community members. So there is a lot of distrust at times, and so it's even more important for us now to be aware of those issues and to show that respect and produce research that is respectful and useful and available. And so especially if there's going to be a long-term research project with a community, these early conversations of who will own this data and who will have access to it and where will it be housed and how will it be useful to us is going to be very important conversations to have. And it also helps build trust and build rapport and can make the research process much richer and much more valid. You get a lot more out of it when the people that you're working with like and trust you and are willing to share. Yeah. All right, and then finally we have our case study, which a number of you are using as well, which ties in together a lot of these different things that we've talked about. The main thing within a case study is it is a bounded system. There are boundaries. You have to define what those boundaries are. This can be very challenging. Sometimes it's easy. My case study is on this class, and it includes all of the people who are in this class and myself, and the 3 rooms in which we meet, and the technology that we use to talk with each other. Those are the boundaries of my case study on this class. I did a network analysis in the Pacific Islands region, where it was climate change professionals in the Pacific Islands. How the hell do you bound that and define who is that? I had a guy in Palau who owned a dive shop. And like rented out dive equipment so that people could go scuba diving. And he was also one of the most active climate change voices in his community. So he is a climate change professional. I also have climatologists who are climate scientists. So obviously they're going to be climate change professionals. But then like, how do you define all of these things? And that's one of the things, is looking for the saturation point where you're not when you're not gathering new data. That's the point at which you say, okay, well, maybe this is the boundaries. Or maybe you define them ahead of time and say, these people, yes, these people, no, this group, this setting, yes, this other group, this other setting, no. So that's oftentimes the biggest challenge, is how do you define exactly what is this case? And that also means temporal bounds. So how long is this? The game's not in this entire season. You're not looking at all of those games, right? So instead it's like these games between this date and this date that aren't canceled due to rain. Stuff like that. So there is your boundary in the time, in the chronology, right? We have our spatial boundaries. We have our human boundaries, our relationship boundaries. There are lots of different ways to look at that. But within a case study, you have to say, what is it a case study of? What am I studying and what am I not studying?
Now, would that be, maybe it's a foolish question, but is that, if you don't set those boundaries, you get too many variables that might dilute your data that you're trying to collect, or you get some pointless data mixed in there that's just confusing the study? Or...
And you also have like questions of, okay, well, if I gathered data about this, why not also this and this and this and this and this? And if I got this but not all of these other things, maybe that means I gathered too much data, or maybe it means there's a giant gap in my data. And so that's why you want to have an explicit boundary. Thoughts, questions on case studies?
I did want to ask specifically regarding my case between the holistic analysis and embedded analysis.
Mhm.
Like, is that that would be the difference between analyzing the whole piece of data that I have or concentrating on one specific thing? Because I think that's kind of where I'm headed. It's
Mhm.
like the whole analyzing or gathering data on the whole team, but things are standing out to me, and so I'm kind of zeroing in on that. Like, say, the difference between the 6th graders and the 8th graders, or the A team and the B team, since
Mhm.
they have practice together.
Mhm.
I mean, I'll probably go away from that because they don't play in the same game together. So,
Mhm.
but would that
Yes.
kind of define the difference between those two?
Yeah, so the holistic would be the whole team, the whole game, all of the interactions that happen within that. The embedded analysis would be like the specific age interactions or team interactions, things like that. On page 74, they have their types of case studies, which can be useful to those of you who are looking at potentially using case study within your research framework. So the instrumental case studies, where you have like a single issue or concern, but you have like a bounded case within that. So Lexi, for example, if you're interested in how the layout of stores affects people's movement as they walk in the door, you could, develop some kind of general knowledge or theories, but you're only looking at this one store in order to say, this is what happens here and this is why. So maybe that would be like an instrumental case study. A collective case study, you would look at multiple cases. Some of you are looking in different spots, but I don't think anybody who is here in this room right now, so we'll skip that. Sorry guys at home watching this. You should have been in class. Let me think. So that's our collective case study, where you're at multiple sites and then kind of like comparing them back and forth in order to find out this one issue within these multiple sites. And then the intrinsic case study is when you are looking at a very, unique opportunity or a unique event. So you're just looking at that and it's not necessarily generalizable to all, but an interesting, unique case right here. And again, with case studies, we would oftentimes develop or gather multiple sources of data, multiple types of data. If it's going to be a full-scale case study, you're probably going to use mixed methods and not just qualitative research, not just observation, not just interviews, but lots of different things, including gathering artifacts and textual references and all sorts of different things like that. The mixed methods will be very important, so that when you move into your analysis, you can, speak with authority on what you have learned. So with any of these 5 approaches, do we have any questions, thoughts, comments? I did, look through compare and contrasts, the Corbin and Strauss, different editions, and sure enough, I'm changing the readings for next week. I did put this on the announcement that I sent out earlier today, so it's on our announcement board. It should also be in your inbox, but just to say it out loud in class, next week, if you have the 3rd edition book, which is this one, I want you to read chapters 4 and 6. And I am pretty sure 4 was already assigned to you earlier in the semester. Sorry about that. Look over it again. At least it's already read, so that'll maybe lighten your load for this week. But chapters 4 and 6, the syllabus says 5 and 6, but don't do that, 4 and 6. And if you are in the 4th edition, this one, which I think at least one of you has, that is chapters 5 and 6. And then after that, it's going to be a number of weeks working with the Creswell book, so I'll let you know when we get, not even into November before we come back to Strauss and Corbin again, so we'll read through Creswell as scheduled because we all have the same edition of that one. All right. Okay, any questions about the class in general or anything else?
If we have more than the 4 observation notes, where do we upload those? Do we try to combine a couple in the last one?
Yeah, you can put them all into one file, or I think I have it set for multiple uploads,
Okay.
so you can put different files in.
Okay.
Yeah. I will only give you 4 grades, but I'll grade the 4 best ones.
Okay.
Unless you give me like 15 of them, then I'll grade the 4 best one of the first few that I read.
Okay.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. All right, if there are no other questions, you are free to go. Great class, guys. Bye.